Hello, and welcome to today's discussion on discovering the nexus between renewable energy and food systems. My name is Garrett McDaniel, and I'm a graduate student at Western Colorado University studying environmental management. With me today is Pete. And Pete, how do you say your last name?
Kolbenschlag.
Kolbenschlag. And
yes.
Pete is the director at Colorado Farm and Food Alliance, and Mary Marshall is the program manager at Solar Energy International Solar Forward Program. So first, thank you both for being here. I would first like to understand both of your organizations. So Mary, can you please tell us about what you do?
Definitely. Thanks so much for having us here, Garrett. Really excited to talk with you today and hope to contribute to your podcast as much as I can.
Thank you.
I work for Solar Energy International. We are a nonprofit training facility and workforce development organization. We train folks on how to design and install solar systems, both online and in person. And our organization has been around since 1991, and we are based in Western Colorado. At SEI, I manage a program called Solar Forward, which provides technical consulting to rural communities looking to kickstart solar markets. This program offers community groups or government departments support in launching solar growth campaigns, as well as providing training to the local community, to some community members. So that's a little bit of my background.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. And Pete, I was doing some research on the Colorado Farm and Food Alliance. So if you don't mind me, I'll read a little snippet of what I found. It says that the CFFA network, family farms, winemakers, brewers, food producers, chefs, restaurateurs, to cultivate and strengthen the local food movement, support sustainable rural communities, and provide a platform for effective climate and conservation advocacy. Wow, that is a ton. So, can you tell me about your organization and what are your top priorities?
Thank you. Thank you, Garrett, for having me on. As part of our mission to enhance regional food security, we're also working to build more just and equitable food systems and communities overall, which I think is kind of my connection to this discussion. But we also work to kind of elevate some of the voices from the farm and food movement as advocates around some specific conservation and climate action type of priorities. We're not a policy organization, but we work in partnership with a lot of other nonprofits and on some of those issues. So we might work to, for instance, help bring some voices from rural folks in Colorado to the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission rulemaking that's going on right now to advocate for strong protections for rural communities. So we do kind of a whole range of things. I think, as far as our, what I call our Green Jedi program, which kind of Jedi is shorthand for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And our program there kind of works to support communities that are economically secure, socially equitable, and ecologically resilient, and where the food system kind of connects with that.
There are a lot of issues as it relates to potentially food safety with whatever recalls might exist, genetically modified crops, lack of equal access to food, food deserts existing in particularly like urban areas. With all of these challenges, what do you think's working well in our current food system?
I mean, obviously, we're feeding a lot of people. There's a lot of variety, both in terms of what you might find on the shelf at the market or what you can order online is crazy. And then just like the variety of restaurants, although, there's some sad impacts that are going to come out of COVID as far as, I think, diversity in restaurants, for instance, might be something we'll see an impact of. So, I mean, I think there are things that are working well. There's obviously opportunities to make improvements. And I think that's the larger question, because I think those opportunities are basically to fundamentally transform how we feed the world and how we feed ourselves. And that's a big undertaking. But when I think about it, and when I was kind of thinking about this conversation, probably one of the first ways humans manipulated their environment was in the production or capture of food. And in fact, that probably predates human to some of our earlier ancestors. So, if you think it's kind of been the nexus of our interaction with the environment for a long time.
That's interesting, because I feel like, I mean, just me personally, my connection to food, it's with a grocery store, right? I don't think of that place where it was actually grown, not until recently. And I have a vegetable garden, so I'm very much more attached to the seasons, and I understand when tomatoes are, should be harvested and that sort of thing. So Mary, I'd like to talk about the transition to renewable energy, albeit slowly. I guess in 2019, for the first time, renewable energy consumption surpassed coal. So that was a pretty big thing. However, despite that achievement, the generation of renewable energy remains low when compared to the total fossil fuel generation, especially with the rise of natural gas. So what do you think needs to happen in order to speed up the transition to renewable energy? Policies or other technologies? What needs to be in place to get us there?
Definitely. I think that it is, there are both solutions on the policy side and on the technology side that need to get us there. On the technology side, I think that, our energy consumption our energy consumption patterns are often referred to as like the duck curve. And that is kind of just as, during the day, solar panels have their peak production hours during the peak zone hours, but that isn't necessarily our peak consumption hours. It's more so first thing in the morning and oftentimes after we come home from work. COVID, of course, has had an impact on our consumption patterns. But for the most part, one challenge of introducing, way more renewables than fossil fuels into the grid has been the issue of how to replace peaker plants, which are essentially what the grid relies on when we have peak power demand. So on the technology side, there's been a lot of talk about battery technology and storage technology to replace those peaker plants. And at this point, there's a lot of funds and attention going into developing some of these technologies. The lithium-ion batteries have been a big hot topic, but there are also folks exploring different types of kind of like a slower discharge rate for batteries. So I think that once the technology becomes financially viable to support the amount of renewable energy needed to replace some of these peaker plants, that will be something that will be totally like a game changer for the grid. And then on the policy side, when we're talking about, especially, looking at Colorado and rural communities that we're working in, there are policies that exist right now that hinder the development of renewable energy on a utility scale. So, for example, a lot of rural electric cooperatives are buying their energy from a wholesale electricity supplier, and they don't really have control over the utility scale development of their energy consumption. They only have control over 5% of creating their own energy. So it is kind of up to those larger wholesale suppliers on what their grid or what their sources of energy are comprised of. And for a while, that has been largely fossil fuel based, but as renewables are becoming more financially viable, more of that is coming onto the grid. But on a policy side, things that could help are investor-owned utilities, developing more utility-scale solar, and also these rural electric cooperatives being able to develop more locally generated energy. So part of that's dependent on policy. Part of that's just economics. A lot of this has been really market dependent on the prices of solar. There are a lot of different things that come into play when it comes to the technology and the affordability of developing these systems, but we have been moving in the right direction.
Pete, do you resonate with what Mary talked about, in particular the rural electric cooperatives?
Our electric co-op was able to go with another large provider to kind of fill in that space while we develop more local energy that is a cleaner source than the coal that was powering us here in Delta and Montrose counties. There's tremendous opportunity, I think, in general, both in the energy and food systems, to think about what it means to be more locally. I don't quite think it's independent because we're interdependent, but to think on smaller scales as far as how we produce and use energy as well as how we produce and use food. I think rural electric cooperatives fill a unique niche in that they can help facilitate that kind of transition where we produce more of our own power and use more of our own power locally much of the time, but also can swap and share it around a little bit as needed. I think at some point we're moving in that direction, and food systems can perhaps operate in some similar ways. One thing COVID taught us about food systems is the vulnerability of some of our supply systems, for instance, and long supply chains and what that means.
Yeah, I was researching. Apparently, 17% of all fossil fuels are consumed in the food production system. So obviously, getting rural electric cooperatives to take a lead into investing in renewable energy for these rural communities, I think that would be certainly helpful. This question's for Mary. Are there sort of smaller scale systems that would be potentially useful for farms and that sort of thing? I'm thinking like irrigation and pumps and that sort of thing.
Definitely. When you're looking at like the agricultural industry, it's such a natural it's such a natural partnership or relationship with renewable energy because it is such a largely energy intensive industry. You have like the care of livestock, you have greenhouses, and when we're talking about value added products within the agricultural industry, we have people using like massive dryers to dry different like produce, and like massive refrigerators, dairy operations, all very energy intensive. These industries can really benefit from both energy efficiency and, like you said, distributed renewable energy systems. So having just kind of a behind the meter opportunity, or having commercial solar or renewable energy systems on these agricultural businesses will, vastly reduce their carbon footprint. And it also is just a really financially viable solution for these producers, because there are a lot of programs and incentives for them to take advantage of to develop energy efficiency and renewable energy systems. And also not paying those massive utility bills will save them a lot of money. So there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of incentives that exist for ag producers to take advantage of. Going beyond solar panels, like you said, there are micro hydro applications. There are applications for like irrigation pumps and just different, solar powered technologies that different farmers can get depending on, where they are within the industry. And all of that is kind of goes back to this holistic picture of like the nexus between energy and food. If we are eliminating the need for fossil fuels in our rural communities, that's less opportunity for those extractive industries to impact the environment in the places where we need clean water and clean air the most for our food.
Pete, what have you seen in your experience? Are farmers transitioning to renewable energy? And if so, how are they doing that?
Farming is a marginal business. It's a business working on the margins, like a lot of businesses are, but farming in particular. And so inputs, expenses, all those things matter hugely. And when you can reduce costs, so when alternatives are available that make sense, people switch. I remember hearing the analogy that, 32 degrees is a piece of ice and 33 degrees is a puddle of water, right? It's 1 degree difference. And that's the difference between renewable energy becoming economically affordable and it not being economically affordable as far as liquidity of capital. Capital moves towards what becomes affordable, and as it becomes affordable, farming and everything else will move in that direction, and they'll move in that direction quickly. It's like the transformation of ice to water. And in that analogy, I think with what Mary was saying, I think this is really important. We think is, the food system ready for renewables. It's like, it's not going to be able to avoid it, for one thing. And so the question becomes it's a holistic question as Mary framed it, right? How do we reduce the needs for energy through efficiencies and anything like that, shortening the supply chain? More local food means we're not, transporting tomatoes from Mexico to put on a burrito in Gunnison. Maybe those tomatoes can come from Montrose or from Gunnison from a hothouse or something. So I think, we look at all those things. So how do we just shrink the fossil fuel food print overall on the front end is the first kind of thing to think about. The second one is like, how do we, and that includes like changing inputs. One of the largest uses of fossil fuels in industrial agriculture is as inputs as feedstock for fertilizers and some of the inputs that go into the ground. So how do we change that? How do we rethink our relationship with the land, where soil is actually the resource and not just kind of a canvas that we're applying chemicals to. So like rethinking some of those relationships, I think, happen before we even think about how we bring renewables into the food system, right? And then we think about how we bring renewables into the food system. But the first step of that is how we do it behind the meter, right? How we just do it to use on-site microhydro to power electric pumps during the irrigation system. Doesn't ever have to go onto the grid at all. Boom, just happens, reduces that demand on the grid for what had been a need powered by fossil fuel not that long ago. Everything on the farm, and particularly in food production, if it's not already, can be electrified. And if it can be electrified, it can be powered from the grid. And if it can be powered from the grid, it can be powered from cleaner energy sources than coal and frack gas.
I would just like to add kind of on that efficiency of our food systems piece. Extremely fascinating. And it's so true. Like when we're talking about developing, for example, solar energy on people's homes, we always recommend that folks dive into energy efficiency before they get their renewable energy system, because they could already be, way more efficient with what they use and paying less for that system. Thinking about this on the macro level and about the inefficiencies that exist in the food system as a whole, things like getting tomatoes from a different country or something, it's only going to make our communities more resilient by keeping as much as possible local. It will only create local economic development by having as much of that happen as close to the source as possible. And I think that that's a really important piece. Talking about the nexus of renewable energy in the food system, there's also huge opportunity there to make our rural communities so much more resilient and to build local economies up.
You're right. Just improving the efficiency of our current systems. How do we do that? How does Pete, how do you, or Mary, how do you go about creating local food systems?
Yeah, those are the big questions. And that's where policy comes in. Policy needs to incentivize movement towards more sustainable practices, and it needs to disincentivize by removing subsidies from harmful practices. And some people say that means picking winners and losers, but I say we need to look at the facts of where agriculture is at, say, in the American Southwest right now, and it's staring at an existential threat coming from climate change that will alter everything about agriculture in the American Southwest within the next several decades. And the degree and the rapidity to which it alters it depends on us. And so, facing that, we have to kind of make some hard decisions about these sorts of things.
Have you seen any local legislation or local policies that encourage or incentivize local food production?
Sure. I think there's a lot of interest in local food production now around the country. I think it's seeing a bit of a renaissance in some ways. Creating local markets is one huge way to address food issues. I think when you think about food security, which to me is kind of the larger issue, how do you build vibrant and resilient food systems that are able to feed people locally and then scale that up, and all those types of issues, I think, are the interesting questions there. And, there's a huge amount of food waste. This gets back to the efficiency first type of rubric, right? But there's a huge amount of food waste in this country. So just like getting rid of food waste is one way. How do we scale up? Well, we could do a much better job of feeding people with any kind of agricultural scale that we're farming at if we got rid of food waste, or if we cut it in half, or if we cut it by 20% or 30% or 80%, right? That would just be boom, a gain right there. One of the reasons we are so dependent on fossil fuels is because of the political system and the power that status quo industries have over the way we do things. And the more important something is, the more fundamental it is, food or energy, the more those powerful interests are going to want to hold sway over it.
I know in Boulder, I live in Boulder County, and one thing we're doing is the county is investing in an industrialized compost facility, and we'll be selling that compost generated to local farmers. So hopefully that reduces the need to buy, fossil fuel-based fertilizers. So creating a market of compost that'll be cheaper or potentially the same cost as fertilizer.
And for instance, one of the presidential candidates' climate plans, the one that has a climate plan, includes agriculture as one of the kind of key platforms. And like, for instance, projects that incentivize soil building are huge, because soil building stores carbon. So it has a climate benefit, but it also stores water. It's basically a reservoir. If you have good, healthy soils, then your land is more resilient to drought, particularly shorter term droughts, and things like that. A good mulch can help promote a lot of beneficial critters and life in the soil that enhances nutritional uptake and all sorts of benefits to crops and to farmers. So you can incentivize that. You can pay people to build soil, and they also receive a tangible benefit in better crop yields and better water retention. So, there's all sorts of creative solutions out there. It's kind of political will, I think, is really the stumbling block, to be honest.
Yeah, there are federal funds available for projects like these. I mean, there are grants that agricultural producers that I work with take advantage of to finance renewable energy systems, to finance large scale, even like statewide campaigns related to energy efficiency and renewable energy for agricultural producers. These are through the USDA. So, a lot of this is coming from the federal level. So talking about moving forward and supporting some of, these aspects of the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, a lot of it is going to depend on, who is going to be in office for the next 4 years. We're definitely really, going into election next week. Hopeful, but, really, also concerned about what is going to happen if, Trump is elected. So that's something that's going to have a really big impact on this. And especially like what Pete was saying, there are a lot of things that are coming from the higher level that are affecting both of these industries, both the food systems and energy. So that's going to be a big one coming up here.
And this is an offhand question. How is the fracking industry impacting the Western Slope?
The fracking industry is primarily impacting the Western Slope currently through politics, because the gas market is in the toilet, so to speak, and there may be one rig operating in Western Colorado. Last I saw, there wasn't even a single one. So, but it's always fuel for political turmoil and tension. And where I live in the North Fork, and there's numerous places on the western slope that are at risk of oil and gas development or oil and gas leasing, which carries an uncertainty with it that threatens and bothers a lot of local business and farms because they don't know what's coming when public lands are leased. So we remain at threat as long as we're subject to kind of some bad land use plans and some other factors that are either currently in play or coming our way, which gets back to elections and having elected leaders that are looking forward and listening to local communities. In this case, protecting the water that feeds the orchards here in the North Fork, and our entire agricultural industry means protecting the national forest, which is the areas that are kind of in the crosshairs for oil and gas activity.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a clear water component to the energy agriculture nexus,
And I guess to me, it's interesting. I just thought of this, but so the fracking in the North Forest, for instance, and really throughout the Piceance, the only thing that would make it viable would be some magic rescue, LNG export hub on the West Coast or something, where they could ship it to Asia. So the threat to a local food hub that's of at least state importance, regional importance, to produce an energy commodity for Asia that they really need to be moving away from anyways, and which very likely become a stranded asset before the project is paid off anyways. It just seems to be the exact opposite of everything we've been talking about on this call. It seems to be 180 degrees in the opposite of direction of where we need to be going. If we think this little place here in the North Fork is a microcosm.
We're talking about the transition from fossil fuel economies to renewable energy economies. In the past, fracking has kind of, in extractive industries, have been sort of like this band-aid economic solution for communities that are in need of more economic resiliency, where there might be, an attempt of some short-term appeal to local government officials to allow their space for fracking, but it does have a much more devastating impact on major economic contributors like agriculture, the outdoor industry that we see in a lot of these rural Western Colorado towns, especially. And when we're talking about, having some renewable energy jobs to diversify the local economy and the local tax base in light of the transition away from fossil fuels, it's really important that, we have a just transition, because it's these extractive industries are benefiting from so many subsidies that the renewable energy industry is not benefiting from in the same way, creating some lower paying jobs in the renewable energy industry that won't be able to add up in the same way and to replace fossil fuels. So it's how do we make this more of a just transition, and how do we, fairly distribute these subsidies to the renewable energy industry and start accepting that this is the future, and that, there really isn't potential in fossil fuels anymore.
And how do we use that trend? I think one thing I'm interested in is, and I think where local food movement fits in this conversation is how to use that transition to strengthen local economies. So Western economies and a lot of rural economies are resource colonies. They export cheap labor, cheap food, cheap resources out of the ground, and the wealth is accrued in urban areas. And the wealth, for the most part, it may look like good pay because they pay at a higher scale than, say, other jobs in an area. But still, the majority of the wealth is being removed from the community. It's not staying in the community. It's going out of the community. How do we create economies that keep a larger portion of the wealth creation machine in the local economy, benefiting local business, being reinvested in local small businesses, employing local people? I also believe energy plays a key role in that too, because we now have technologies to both produce more energy affordably locally in a lot of different places from a lot of different sources, and figure out how to let that energy, how to share it and communicate those needs and demands more efficiently. We're getting better and better at that. And that makes us stronger and more secure locally. It makes us more energy independent to get off of fossil fuels than to develop fossil fuels.
And I'll just add this whole just transition where many states, it's the revenue of coal is managed at the state. Well, in Colorado, that's managed at the county level. And many, I think all of the counties have not managed that taxable revenue. So, as coal mines shut down, as coal plants retire, it leaves these communities with absolutely nothing.
In Colorado, the money gets passed on to the counties and there's no rainy day fund, so to speak. It's the same with oil and gas revenue. And some counties have set up rainy day funds where they divert a portion of their mineral revenue into the kind of what next. But a number of counties haven't. They've just dumped it into their general fund and used it to fund schools and everything else. It's kept property taxes super depressed in a lot of like coal and resource dependent Western counties. And so the tax base is basically the mineral revenue. And so it's a real challenge when we think of transitions, is how to fund those types of services. But those are the types of knots we have to untangle. I mean, we don't have a choice. The transition is coming. How do we position rural communities to succeed in that transition? That's the question we should be asking.
One other topic here. It's the issue of urbanization. By 2050, the United Nations reports that food production must increase by 70%. So what sort of role does indoor agriculture and how might that be a solution to food deserts?
I would start the question as urban agriculture, because I don't think you have to jump indoors immediately, right? I think you can have like community food parks and community gardens on rooftops and lots of ways to enhance urban space as well as produce food. So that would be kind of my first thing. And then otherwise, I think indoor, vertical gardens and all these different things they're thinking of as far as some of the indoor gardening. I think those are all interesting technologies. We shouldn't discount them or rule them out. As far as any kind of indoor agriculture goes, inputs matter. So where is the energy coming from? If it's frack gas power that's lighting up your operation, then it's not sustainable. What are you doing with water? Are you recycling water on site? There's all sorts of questions about sustainability.
Right. There's the heating and cooling of the buildings, making sure those HVAC systems are energy efficient. Mary, what do you think about this issue?
I think that, if we are talking about indoor agriculture, that's something that you are going to need renewable energy to support a kind of energy intensive industry like that, which also brings us back to this holistic Nexus idea of we need to make sure our system is just as efficient as possible before expanding a lot more. Just because, if we keep like growing and consuming at the rate that we are, that's like such a huge undertaking with the amount of energy that we're consuming. But if we can create a more efficient system while we can, and then, work on converting like that more efficient system to renewables, that is like the better path to be on. So I hope that when we do develop future ideas to sustain the population in agriculture, that we think of those future solutions and technologies in a sustainable way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Here I thought, we're going to be talking about renewable energy, technology improvements to support the existing food system, where really it sounds like we need to take a step back and analyze what is our current system? What are the current processes in place before we even try to, expand renewable energy on a pretty big scale. Anyway, this has been super productive. I've certainly enjoyed the conversation. Are there any last points that you all want to make?
As a world and at this, even at the micro scale, as communities, how we approach food and energy are going to be some of the top issues in the next 2 decades. So I think it's a timely conversation. I do think the way to approach it is to think of improving systems on the front end, like Mary said, efficiencies, reducing demands, improving systems. That's the first step in all these, in solving all these problems. The second step, I think, is, and that's to me what things like urban gardens are, is it's not to replace the need for farms in rural areas. It's to think of it as the behind the meter approach to energy. It's to maximize what you're producing using locally before you then rely on supply chains that bring it somewhere else. And then when you rely on those supply chains, you look to how we can shrink them, right? The question isn't how I can get the cheapest tomatoes to the most number of Taco Bell franchises. The question is how I can get a tomato that I want for this food I'm going to create from a place that has a shorter supply chain, right? And so if we start thinking of kind of what the problem we're trying to solve is, it's not to sell as many tacos for the cheapest price necessarily.
And that's a fundamental system change there.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's so true. I totally agree with Pete. And I think, a lot of it kind of will involve a lot of innovation and rethinking of our current system, which is hard to, develop totally new ideas that are different than, what we've been doing in our lives. But if you think about it, it's not like a totally foreign concept. I feel like this is how humans have been living, like historically, before like the Industrial Revolution and age of like mass consumption of things that we don't necessarily need. So, I think that we can be more efficient in our food systems. And, I'm just hoping that like folks who come into power politically will be on the right side of history when it comes to making sure like our growth as a human population is efficient and sustainable.
I second that. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you, Pete.